June 1983, Alstead County. Alara Gable stood at the edge of the West Bottom, a place that had been swallowing hope for 3 generations. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decay, a scent that clung to the hollows long after the spring rains had passed. The field, a 40-acre depression of alluvial clay, held water like a bowl. Even now, weeks into what should have been the growing season, shallow pools of stagnant water mirrored the flat, gray sky. Cattails were beginning to push up at the margins, a sign of surrender. She was 48 years old. Her husband, Silas, had been gone for 2 winters, the victim of a weak heart that had finally given out in the quiet of a January dawn. The community had offered its condolences and its quiet, pitying predictions. A woman alone couldn't run a 300-acre farm, especially not one with a piece of ground as cursed as the West Bottom. They saw her in town, at the feed co-op or the grocery, and noted the new lines around her eyes. They noted the solid frame of her body, the strength in her shoulders that came from a lifetime of work, but they interpreted it through the lens of their assumptions. She was a widow, a woman whose purpose was now gone, a caretaker of a failing legacy. The West Bottom was the heart of the problem. It was the farm's most significant piece of tillable land, and it was useless. It drowned the corn seedlings in May and baked them in August. The clay, once saturated, would hold the water on its surface, starving the roots of oxygen. Then, under the relentless summer sun, it would shrink and crack, forming a brick-hard crust that no root could penetrate and no moisture could escape. It was a paradox of drowning and thirst, a puzzle that had broken better farmers than her. Her father-in-law, Thomas Gable, had tried to solve it in the 50s. He had hired a man with a steam-powered ditching machine to cut deep channels to the creek at the far end. The channels had filled with silt within a decade. He had mortgaged a neighboring parcel to pay for it, a debt that Silas had spent his first 10 years of marriage paying off. The failure was a quiet legend in the family, a monument to good intentions and bad geology. In the 70s, Silas himself had tried. He believed in newer methods. He had invested in a subsoiler, a great, curved tooth of steel pulled behind their most powerful tractor, the International 1066. The idea was to break up the hardpan, the compacted layer of clay that lay a foot beneath the topsoil, and allow the water to drain into the substrata. He had spent a week driving back and forth, the diesel engine screaming as the steel fought the earth. The field drank the autumn rains that year, and for a moment, they had thought he had won. But the first wet spring proved the effort futile. The immense weight of the water, sitting on the clay for weeks, had simply recompacted the soil, sealing the fractures he had made. The clay had healed itself, leaving the problem exactly as it had been. The community accepted it. The West Bottom was sour ground, a lost cause. It was a permanent feature of the landscape, like the granite outcrop on the East Ridge or the bitterness of the wild apples in the fence rows. The prevailing wisdom was to enroll it in a government set-aside program, plant it with switchgrass, and forget it. It was a wound best covered over. But Alara could not forget it. The farm was losing money. The 260 acres that remained were good, but they were not enough to carry the dead weight of the 40 acres that produced nothing but property tax bills. Selling the parcel was an option, one the banker had gently suggested. A corporate outfit, AgriCorp, was buying up land in the county. They would pay a fair price for it, bulldoze the fence rows, and absorb it into their vast, featureless holdings. The thought of it was a physical ache in her chest. It would be a betrayal of Silas, of Thomas, of the very idea of the Gable farm. So she stood at the edge of the field, her boots sinking slightly into the soft mud, and looked. She was not a farmer by training. She was a farmer by marriage, by observation, by 30 years of listening. She had walked this field with Silas in every season. She knew the way the fog settled here first, the way the red-winged blackbirds preferred the western edge, the way a certain patch of ground near the old oak always dried out a week before the rest. She held a different kind of knowledge, one not found in university textbooks or soil test printouts. The next Tuesday, a white county pickup truck with a university extension logo on the door pulled into her lane. A young man in a clean polo shirt and khaki pants stepped out. He was David Hansen, the new extension agent. He carried a stainless steel soil probe and a clipboard. He was confident, educated, and eager to help. He had called the week before, offering a free consultation. It was part of a new county initiative to modernize and optimize local farms. Alara had agreed, knowing it was expected of her, a gesture of acknowledging the world beyond her property line. "Mrs. Gable," he said, extending a hand. His grip was firm but soft, a city man's handshake. "David Hansen, thanks for letting me come out." "Alara is fine," she said. Her voice was quiet, used more for speaking to animals than to people. She led him to the west bottom. He stopped at the edge, making a low whistle. "Well," he said, "the satellite maps didn't do it justice. That's some serious standing water." He walked a few feet into the field, the mud sucking at his clean work boots. He expertly twisted the soil probe into the ground, pulled out a core of dark, slick clay, and crumbled it between his fingers. He did this in 3 different spots. He took measurements with a handheld device, squinting at the digital display. "Classic vertisol clay," he announced, as if diagnosing a common illness. "High shrink-swell capacity. When it gets wet, the clay particles expand and seal it up tighter than a drum. Then when it dries, it cracks. I saw the infrareds from last summer. Looked like a desert floor." Alara said nothing. She had seen it too. They walked back to his truck, where he spread a topographical map across the hood. "Here's the problem," he said, tracing a finger over the contour lines. "You're in a natural basin, and according to the county soil survey, you've got a dense fragipan about 30 inches down. It's like a concrete floor under your whole field. The water has nowhere to go but sideways, and it's too flat for that." He clicked a pen and started writing on a form on his clipboard. "The standard recommendation here would be extensive pattern tiling. We'd lay perforated pipe every 30 feet, route it to a main, and run that to the creek." "But," he paused, looking at her with an expression of professional sympathy, "the grade is so slight, you'd need a lift station to pump it out. The cost would be significant, probably $25,000. He let the number hang in the air. It was more than the farm had cleared in the last 3 years combined. It was an impossible sum. "The alternative," he continued, "is a more aggressive tillage program. Deep ripping down to 36 inches with a multi-shank ripper. Something big. A D8 cat could pull it. That would fracture the fragipan. Then you need to follow up with a heavy lime application to alter the soil chemistry and improve flocculation." He used these words easily, the vocabulary of his profession. "But again, you're talking about hiring heavy equipment. Fuel costs alone would be high, and there's no guarantee it would hold. The clay might just reseal, like I suspect it did before." He had heard the stories. He had done his homework. "Honestly, Alara," he said, dropping the formal Mrs. Gable to signal a shift to sincere, man-to-man advice. "My off-the-record recommendation? Put it in the Conservation Reserve Program. They'll pay you a small stipend per acre to plant it in native grasses. It'll take the tax burden off, and you can stop fighting it. Sometimes the best move is to quit the game." He looked at her, expecting agreement, or at least a weary nod of defeat. Alara looked past him, her gaze fixed on the center of the field. A memory surfaced, sharp and clear. It was Silas, 10 years ago, standing in this exact spot after a summer thunderstorm. The field had been planted in soybeans that year, and the storm had flattened them. The water was already beginning to pool. Silas wasn't angry. He was watching, listening. "What do you think?" Hansen prompted gently. "The water doesn't want to go to the creek," Alara said, her voice so low he had to lean in to hear it. Hansen blinked. "I'm sorry. The creek is too far," she said, still looking at the field. "It's not the natural way." He gave a small, indulgent smile. "Well, with all due respect, hydrology doesn't really care about the natural way. It cares about gravity. We'd be creating an artificial gradient with a pumping station." "It's too expensive," she stated. It was not an argument, just a fact. "Yes, it is," he conceded. "That's why the CRP is your most realistic option. Cut your losses. Focus on the acres that actually produce." He folded the map, and slid it back into a tube. He had made his assessment, delivered his expert opinion. His job was done. As he drove away, Alara remained at the edge of the field. She knew how the conversation would be reported in town. Hansen, a good young man, had tried to help the poor Gable widow. He had offered her sound, practical advice based on the latest science. But she was lost in her grief, stubborn, unwilling to accept the reality of her situation. They would shake their heads at the feed store. A shame, they would say. Silas would have listened to reason. The men were gathered around the wood stove at the Alstead County Feed and Seed, even though it was June and the stove was cold. It was a habit, a focal point for the slow currents of local talk. Earl, who ran the store, was leaning on the counter. Two farmers, Jim and Dennis, were in their usual chairs. David Hansen's white truck had been seen turning out of the Gable Lane an hour earlier. "Saw the county boy went out to see Alara," Dennis said, pulling a piece of lint from his overalls. "Yep," Earl confirmed. "He stopped in here for a coffee on his way. Said he was going to take a look at the West Bottom." Jim grunted. "Not much to look at. Same as it's always been. A mud hole in the spring, a brick in the summer. Wasted my time helping Silas with that subsolar 10 years back. Burned up half a tank of diesel for nothing." "Hansen knows his stuff," Dennis allowed. "Got a degree from the state university. He told me I needed to up the potassium on my north field, and damned if he wasn't right. Best yield I've had in years." "Knowledge from a book ain't the same as knowledge from the dirt," Jim countered, a familiar refrain. But on the West Bottom, the dirt's had the last word for 60 years. No book's going to change that. "So what's the boy genius recommend?" Dennis asked. "Said they could tile it, but it'd cost a fortune. Need a pump and all," Earl relayed. "Said the best thing for her to do is put it in the government program. Take the money and run." There was a general murmur of agreement. It was the sensible thing to do. It was the only thing to do. "Hope she listens," Jim said. "She's a good woman, but she's alone now. Can't be letting pride get in the way of good sense." That field broke her father-in-law's spirit, and it gave Silas more grief than it was worth. "It's the grief talking, maybe," Dennis suggested, lowering his voice. "Sometimes when you lose someone, you hold on too tight to the things they left, the problems they fought. You think if you could solve their problem, it's like, I don't know, like you're finishing their work." The men nodded. It was a profound thought for a Tuesday morning. It sounded true. It painted a picture of Alara that made sense to them. A grieving widow, clinging to a lost cause out of sentiment, unable to see the practical, logical path forward. They pitied her. They wished her well. But they had already written off her in the West Bottom. That evening, Alara did not sit in the living room with the television on. Instead, she went to Silas's old office, a small room off the kitchen that smelled of pipe tobacco, old paper, and motor oil. She pulled a key from a hook and unlocked the bottom drawer of his metal filing cabinet. Inside were 24 spiral-bound notebooks. They were filled with Silas's neat, compact handwriting. For 40 years, he had kept a journal of the farm. Not a diary of feelings, but a log of facts. Daily rainfall amounts, measured in a green glass gauge on a fence post. High and low temperatures. Wind direction. The date the first frost arrived and the date the last one left. He recorded planting dates, germination rates, fertilizer applications, and harvest yields for every field. But he recorded other things, too. The day the swallows returned in the spring. The first time he heard the chorus frogs in the marsh. The level of the water in the old hand-dug well behind the barn, measured on the first of every month. He drew maps, sketched drainage patterns after heavy rains, noted where the snow lingered longest in the winter. It was a massive, daunting collection of data, a story of the farm told in numbers and quiet observations. Alara had looked through them after he died, but it had been too painful. Now, she pulled out the notebooks from the last 15 years. She lit a single lamp on the desk and began to read. She was not looking for crop data. She was looking for notes on the West Bottom. She found them, scattered throughout the years, entries filled with a familiar mix of hope and frustration. Tried deep ripping, September 73. Ground was hard, but broke up well then, a later entry, May 74. West Bottom is a lake. No better than before. The water sealed it back up. She kept reading, going deeper into the past. She found the memory she was looking for from that day of the summer thunderstorm. It was in a notebook from 1971. July 12th, 1971. Heavy storm at 3 p.m., 24 inches in 1 hour. West bottom flooded, beans flattened. Walk the edge with Alara. The water just sits there. The tile lines Thomas put in are useless. The subsoil channels are useless. It's like pouring water on a tabletop. Then, a new entry, written later that night, the handwriting more thoughtful, less hurried. Thinking about the west bottom, everyone tries to get the water to run off, to the creek. But the old maps show this whole area was a swamp before it was cleared. A seasonal wetland. The water doesn't want to run off. It wants to go down. Thomas always said his father told him there was a gravel vein under that field, an old riverbed. Said the water in the house well and the water in the barn well tasted different because the house well tapped the vein and the barn well was just surface water. We're sitting on top of the answer. The problem isn't getting rid of the water. The problem is the cap. That damn clay is like a lid on a jar. Alara sat back, the book open in her hands. The memory was now anchored by Silas's own words. The core principle, the water wants to go down. This was Silas's secret theory, the one he never acted on. He had been beaten down by the failures of the subsoiler, burdened by the farm's finances. He had never found the time or the courage to try something so radically different from conventional wisdom. It had remained a private speculation, a few lines in a notebook. She turned the page. On the back of the sheet, he had drawn a rough map of the west bottom. In the center, he had drawn a wavy line, like a snake running north to south. Next to it, he had written, gravel vein, runs from the oak to the low spot by the north fence. Ground is always a little firmer there. Dries first. He had seen it. He had mapped it in his mind, with his feet, over decades of walking the land. He had not had the tools or the opportunity to prove it. Alara closed the notebook. The path forward was no longer obscure. It was not Hanson's path of expensive pumps and government programs. It was Silas's path, the one he had sketched out in the quiet of his office a decade ago. It was a path that required not a massive investment of money, but a massive investment of faith in a dead man's theory. She did not need a D8 Caterpillar. She did not need $25,000. She needed to break the cap. She needed to give the water a way to go down. The next morning, she drove the farm's old Ford pickup into town. She did not go to the bank or the heavy equipment dealer. She went to a farm auction clearinghouse on the edge of the county, a place where old, forgotten machinery rusted in neat rows. She was looking for something specific. She walked past massive combines and disc harrows, their paint faded, their tires cracked. She found what she was looking for in the back corner, a tractor-mounted post-hole auger. It was a simple device, a gearbox and a long, corkscrew-shaped bit, designed to be powered by a tractor's power takeoff shaft. This one was old, a Danuser F8 model from the 1960s, covered in a layer of rust and dried mud. But the gearbox was sound, and the auger itself was not bent. The auctioneer, a man who knew her and Silas, looked at her with curiosity. "What are you going to do with that old thing, Alara?" "Fencing, something like that," she said. She paid him $75 for it. It was more than it was worth, but she did not haggle. Her next stop was the quarry. She spoke to the foreman and ordered a truckload of 3/4-inch clean drainage gravel and a truckload of coarse sand. The final stop was the feed store. The men were there, in their usual spots. They watched as she loaded 50-pound sacks of alfalfa seed, chicory seed, and daikon radish seed into the back of her truck. It was an unusual combination for that time of year. Alfalfa was common enough, but the big, deep-rooted radishes were mostly seen as a weed. "Planting a cover crop, Alara?" Earl asked from the loading dock. "Just trying something different on the bottom," she said, not meeting his eyes. The whispers followed her as she drove away. Post-hole digger, gravel, radish seed. It made no sense. It confirmed their narrative. Poor Alara was not thinking clearly. Her grief was making her do strange, impractical things. Back at the farm, she backed the 1972 Massey Ferguson 165 up to the auger. It was Silas's favorite tractor. It was smaller than the big International, but it was nimble and reliable. He had maintained it himself, with religious devotion. Every grease fitting was clean, every fluid was fresh. Alara knew the machine as well as he had. She wrestled the heavy drive shaft into place, connecting the tractor's engine to the auger's gearbox. Then, she drove out to the west bottom. The ground was finally dry enough to support the weight of the tractor without sinking. She carried a dozen wooden stakes with bright orange flags tied to them. She walked the line that Silas had drawn in his notebook, the line from the big oak tree at the southern edge to the low spot by the northern fence. She did not need a map. She could feel it under her feet. Just as Silas had written, the ground along this invisible spine was subtly firmer. It was a difference a stranger would never notice, but to her, it was as clear as a painted line. She walked the length of it, 300 yards, and drove the stakes into the ground, one every 20 feet. This was her target. She started at the northernmost stake. She positioned the tractor, lowered the heavy auger until its point touched the earth, and engaged the PTO. The auger began to turn, slowly at first, then with steady force. It scraped away the dry topsoil, then hit the dense, wet clay below. The tractor's engine deepened its tone, taking the load. Muddy clay began to spiral up out of the hole. It was slow, hard work. She had to raise the auger every foot or so to clear the clay from its blades. She went down 1 foot, then 2. At 30 inches, the resistance suddenly increased dramatically. The auger whined and the tractor strained. This was the fragipan the concrete-like layer Hansen had identified. She kept the pressure on. The steel groaned. For a moment, she thought it would not break through. Then, with a lurch, the resistance lessened. The auger bit deeper. She had broken through the cap. She kept going. 4 feet. 5 feet. 6. At nearly 7 feet down, the texture of the soil coming up the auger changed again. The slick gray clay was replaced by a gritty, darker mixture of sand and small, rounded stones. She disengaged the PTO and raised the auger. She knelt by the hole and reached a hand inside. It was cool and damp. She pulled out a handful of the material. It was gravel, an old riverbed, just as Silas's grandfather had said. It was real. A slow, quiet smile touched her lips. It was not a smile of triumph, but of confirmation. Silas had been right. The knowledge was true. For the next 2 weeks, she worked. Every day, from dawn until the light began to fade, she was on the Massey Ferguson. She drilled a hole at every one of the flag stakes. Each hole was a battle. She would drill down, hit the fragipan, and lean into the controls, trusting the old tractor's steady power to push through. And she would drill deeper, down into the gravel vein. She drilled 15 holes, each 7 feet deep, running in a straight line down the center of the field. The work was methodical, repetitive, and exhausting. Her arms and back ached. Her hands were raw, covered in grease and clay. But she did not stop. Jim and Dennis, her neighbors, saw her from the road. They saw the little red tractor, the strange machine on the back, the neat row of dirt piles accumulating in the middle of the useless field. They shook their heads. "What in God's name is she doing?" Dennis asked one afternoon, stopping his truck where Jim was mending a fence. "Beats me," Jim said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Looks like she's digging a well. Or 15 of them. Maybe she's prospecting for oil," he laughed, but there was no humor in it. It was the laughter of incomprehension. "I tell you, it's a sad thing to watch." David Hansen drove by on his way to another farm. He slowed his truck, his brow furrowed in confusion. He saw the piles of dirt, the auger. He recognized the machine and its purpose. She was drilling holes. It fit no known agricultural theory. It was not in any of his textbooks. He concluded it was a symptom of her grief, a futile, nonsensical act of a mind unmoored by loss. He felt a pang of pity and drove on, reinforcing his decision to recommend the CRP program in his official report. She was, he concluded, not capable of managing the property rationally. Once the holes were dug, the next phase of the work began. She used the tractor's front-end loader to bring the truckloads of sand and gravel to the field. At each hole, She first shoveled in a layer of the coarse sand, creating a filter at the bottom. Then, she filled each hole to within a foot of the surface with the clean drainage gravel. She had created 15 vertical drains, 15 stone-filled wells that punched through the impermeable clay lid and connected the surface to the deep, porous gravel vein below. They were conduits, passages for the water to follow its natural inclination to go down. But the wells alone were not enough. The water still had to get to them. For this, she used another of Silas's old tools. It was a single-shank subsoiler, much smaller than the massive one he had tried to use years before. She mounted it to the tractor's three-point hitch. Starting at the edge of the field, she drove towards the line of new stone wells. She lowered the steel shank deep into the ground, about 20 inches down, just above the fragipan. She drove in a straight line, pulling the tooth of steel through the compacted clay. It did not shatter the deep hard pan, but created a fissure, a crack in the upper layer. She made dozens of these passes, all of them angled slightly downhill, all of them aimed toward the central spine of gravel wells. She was not trying to drain the whole field at once. She was creating a network of shallow, underground channels, like the veins on a leaf, all leading to the central stem. She was inviting the water, giving it a path to follow. The work was slow, and the tractor burned through diesel. But it was a fraction of the cost of the solutions Hansen had proposed. The total expense for the auger, the gravel, the sand, and the seed was less than $500. The rest was her own labor, her own time. When the subsoiling was finished, the field looked scored and scarred, but the real work was hidden underground. Finally, she attached a broadcast seeder to the tractor. She mixed the alfalfa, chicory, and daikon radish seeds together. She drove back and forth across the field, the seeds raining down onto the prepared ground. Then she followed with a light disc to cover them. These were not random choices. Silas's notebooks had mentioned them. Alfalfa, with its powerful taproot that could reach 10, even 15 feet deep, would seek out the moisture in the gravel vein and keep the channels open. Chicory had a similar deep-rooting habit, and the daikon radishes, which the seed salesman called tillage radishes, would grow thick, powerful roots that would drill down into the compacted clay. In the winter, the radishes would die and rot, leaving behind deep, open holes filled with organic matter, further improving the soil's structure and porosity. She was not just building a mechanical system of drainage. She was planting a biological one that would maintain and improve itself over time. By late July, her work was done. The west bottom was planted. All she could do now was wait. The community had watched her strange, lonely project for weeks. Their initial pity had hardened into a kind of certainty. She was lost. The farm would be sold by the next year. It was inevitable. The first test came in late August. A storm system rolled in from the west, the kind that could drop a summer's worth of rain in a single afternoon. Dark clouds gathered, and the sky opened up. 3 inches of rain fell in 2 hours. All over Alstead County, fields turned to lakes. Water ran in sheets across the roads. Jim and Dennis watched the rain from their porches, knowing their own low-lying fields would be flooded for days, the standing water scalding the roots of their corn in the hot sun that was sure to follow. Jim thought of Alara. "Poor woman," he said to his wife. "All that work, and this rain will just turn it into a mud pit. If she was trying to dry it out, she picked a hell of a year." The next morning, the sun was bright and hot. Alara drove the pickup down the lane and stopped at the edge of the west bottom. She held her breath. There was no standing water, not a single pool. The surface of the field was dark and damp, but it was not flooded. The ground was firm. She walked out into the middle of it to the line of her wells. The earth around them was no wetter than anywhere else. The system had worked. The immense volume of water had hit the surface, moved through the shallow fissure she had cut, and drained down through the stone wells into the deep gravel vein, which had channeled it away safely underground. The field had swallowed the storm. A week later, David Hansen was driving his route. He had a meeting with a farmer on the other side of the county. He drove past the Gable place without intending to stop. His report was already filed. He had officially recommended the land be put into the CRP. He had done his job. But as he passed the west bottom, he hit the brakes. His mind could not reconcile what his eyes were seeing. He pulled the truck on his shoulder and got out. The field was not a brown, scarred patch of earth. It was green. A thick, vibrant carpet of young plants covered the entire 40 acres. The alfalfa, the chicory, the radishes, they had germinated in the damp, aerated soil and were now thriving. The field looked more alive than any other in the county. He walked to the fence line, staring. It was impossible. His soil test, his topographical maps, his entire education told him that this field should be a waterlogged swamp after the recent rains. It should be showing signs of root rot, of anaerobic soil conditions. Instead, it looked like a prime pasture. He remembered the post-hole auger, the piles of dirt. He had dismissed it as madness. Now, he was confronted with the undeniable result. He was a man of science, of data. But the data in front of him contradicted all of his models. He felt a prickle of unease, the first tremor in the foundation of his professional certainty. He got back in his truck, his mind racing, and drove away. The image of the green field burned into his memory. The fall passed, and the winter came. The deep-rooted cover crops did their work, their roots pushing deeper, creating channels, drawing up nutrients. The radishes swelled, breaking up the clay, then died with the first hard frost, their decaying bodies feeding the soil. In the spring, Alara did not plow the field. Plowing, she knew from Silas's notes, would destroy the soil structure she was trying to build. Instead, she borrowed a no-till planter from a forward-thinking farmer in next county. She planted corn directly into the residue of the cover crop, which now formed a protective mat on the soil surface. The men at the feed store heard about it and shook their heads anew. No-till was a new, strange idea. Not plowing was sacrilege. Planting into a field of dead weeds was madness. Combined with her well-digging antics from the year before, it cemented her reputation as an eccentric, a woman clinging to bizarre, homemade remedies. But the spring rains came, and again the west bottom did not flood. The mat of organic matter softened the impact of the raindrops, and the open soil structure drank the moisture in, storing it deep in the soil profile. Her corn sprouted, strong and uniform. The summer of 1984 was a dry one. A high-pressure system settled over the region in July and did not move for 6 weeks. The sun beat down from a cloudless sky. Ponds shrank. Creeks ran low. In the fields around the county, corn began to suffer. The plants, shallow-rooted in the compacted soil, could not reach the deep moisture. Their leaves curled up during the day to conserve water, a telltale sign of drought stress. By August, the stalks were turning brown and brittle. Yields were going to be devastated. Jim and Dennis watched their own crops wither. They drove past Alara's place and looked at the west bottom, the field that was supposed to be the worst on her farm. Her corn was fine. It was more than fine. It was tall, green, and healthy. Its leaves were open, drinking in the sun. Her corn was not suffering because its roots had followed the channels left by the dead cover crops, pushing deep into the soil. They had reached the subsoil, where the water from the spring rains was still stored, held in reserve. The field that had once drowned its crops in the spring was now nursing them through a drought. She had not just fixed the drainage. She had created a reservoir. The climax of any farmer's year is the harvest. It is the final accounting, the moment when all the work, all the hope, all the theories are rendered into cold, hard numbers. In October, the combines began to roll across Alstead County. The mood was grim. Yields were down by 30, even 40%. The drought had been too long, too severe. Alara hired a local man with a combine to harvest her corn. She met him at the field with Silas's old grain truck and the weigh wagon. The weigh wagon was the ultimate arbiter of truth. It was a simple grain cart with a built-in scale. It measured the exact weight of the grain coming off each acre. The combine started at the edge of the west bottom. The man driving it had harvested this field for Silas years ago. In the few years they had managed to get a crop to grow at all. He remembered yields of 60, maybe 70 bushels per acre. A respectable yield for a good field in the county that year would be 100. He filled the combine's hopper on the first pass and dumped it into the weigh wagon. Alara checked the scale, did the quick calculation for moisture content, and wrote the number down in a new notebook. The number was 172 bushels per acre. The combine driver stared at the scale, then at Alara, then at the field. He thought the scale was broken. He harvested another section, farther into the field. He dumped it into the weigh wagon. 178. They worked all day. The numbers held. The average for the entire 40-acre field, the cursed west bottom, was 175 bushels per acre. In a year of devastating drought, on a piece of land everyone knew was worthless, Alara Gable had produced a crop that was nearly double the county average. It was not just a success, it was a miracle. It was an impossibility that could not be denied. The news traveled with the speed of gossip. The combine driver told his brother. His brother told Earl at the feed store. By the next day, everyone in Alstead County knew. The men at the stove fell silent when the numbers were spoken aloud. Their pity, their condescension, their narrative of the grieving, foolish widow, it all evaporated in the face of that number. 175. It was a fact as solid and undeniable as the granite on the East Ridge. Their understanding of the world had been shaken. They had been wrong. Completely, utterly wrong. A week after the harvest, the White County pickup truck pulled into Alara's lane again. David Hansen got out. He was not wearing his confident, professional smile. He held his hat in his hands, turning the brim over and over. He walked to the farmhouse door and knocked. Alara opened it. She looked at him, her expression calm, unreadable. "Mrs. Gable," he said. "Alara, I was wrong." The words came out with difficulty, but they were sincere. "I saw your yield report at the co-op. I drove by the field. I've been reading my soil manuals all week, and nothing can explain it. I officially reported this land as non-arable. I told the USDA it was best suited for a conservation program. I was wrong." He looked up at her, his eyes full of a humility she had not seen before. "I came here to tell you that, and to ask if you would be willing to tell me what you did. I don't want to waste your time. I need to understand." Alara did not smile in triumph. There was no "I told you so" in her eyes. She simply nodded. "Come in," she said. She did not lead him to the living room. She led him to Silas's office. The room was the same, but felt different now. It was not just a place of memory. It was a place of living knowledge. She gestured for him to sit in the old wooden chair. She remained standing. She pulled out Silas's notebook, the one from 1971, and opened it to the page with the map. She laid it on the desk in front of him. "My husband knew," she began. "He knew the water didn't want to run off. It wanted to go down. Everyone was fighting the land. He believed we needed to work with it." She explained the theory of the gravel vein, the idea passed down from Silas's grandfather. She explained the concept of the clay cap, the impermeable lid that was the real source of the problem. Hansen stared at the hand-drawn map, at the decades-old handwriting. "A subsurface gravel deposit? An old stream bed," he murmured. "It's not on any of the county geological surveys." "The surveys are made from a distance," Alara said simply. "Silas made his by walking. For 40 years. She then explained what she had done. She told him about the auger, about drilling through the fragipan to reach the vein. She described the stone wells, how they acted as vertical pipelines for the water. She explained the shallow subsoiling, creating fissures that led to the wells. "You created a gravity-fed injection system," he said, the wonder in his voice growing. "You bypassed the fragipan entirely. The water isn't draining off the surface. It's recharging the deep aquifer. It's going where it wants to go," she corrected gently. Then she told him about the cover crops, the alfalfa and chicory to keep the deep channels open, the tillage radishes to break up the compaction in the upper layers and add organic matter. "That's why you survived the drought," he said, the final piece of the puzzle clicking into place. "You didn't just drain the excess water in the spring. You stored it. You banked it deep in the soil profile where the summer sun couldn't evaporate it. The corn's roots followed the paths the cover crops made and tapped into that reserve. It's brilliant. It's a completely integrated system." He looked from a notebook to her. his respect for her growing with every word. He had come to her farm with satellite maps, digital meters, and a university degree. He had seen a problem of chemistry and engineering. She, armed with a dead man's notebook and a lifetime of observation, had seen a living system. She had not imposed a solution on the land. She had listened to it and given it what it needed. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice quiet. "When I was here before, why didn't you explain this?" Alara looked out the small office window towards the now-harvested West Bottom. "You weren't ready to listen," she said. It was not an accusation. It was a statement of fact. "You came to tell me what you knew. You didn't come to ask what I knew." The truth of her words settled on him, heavy and undeniable. He had been so sure of his own expertise, so confident in his data, that he had never once considered that the quiet widow standing before him might possess a deeper, more relevant knowledge. He had pitted her. He had dismissed her. He had been a fool. He stood up. "Thank you, Alara," he said. "Thank you for teaching me." David Hansen was a different man when he left the Gable farm that day. The foundation of his certainty had been replaced by a new, more profound curiosity. He went back to his office and formally withdrew his report on the West Bottom. In its place, he wrote a new one, a detailed account of Alara's system, complete with diagrams he drew himself, based on her explanation. He called it the Gable percolation method. He had not stopped there. He went to his superiors at the state university and proposed a new initiative. He argued that the Extension Service was too reliant on centralized data and standardized solutions. They were ignoring a vast, unwritten library of knowledge that existed in the heads and notebooks of old farmers across the state. The proposal was met with skepticism, but Hansen was persistent. He used the West Bottom as his case study, the undeniable data of the harvest as his proof. Eventually, they agreed. He was put in charge of the Generational Knowledge Project, a program dedicated to interviewing older farmers, documenting their site-specific knowledge, and integrating their wisdom with modern scientific understanding. His job was no longer to tell farmers what to do. It was to listen to them. Back on the farm, life settled into a new rhythm. The West Bottom, now healed, was no longer a source of anxiety. It was the farm's most reliable producer, a testament to a theory proven true. In the evenings, Alara would sit in Silas's office and make her own entries in a new notebook. She recorded the rainfall, the planting dates, the yield data from the bottom field. She was continuing the record, adding her own chapter to the story of the land. The old Massey Ferguson 165 sat in the barn, cleaned and serviced. It was more than a machine. It was a symbol of a certain way of thinking, patient, reliable, built for the long haul. It represented a scale of farming that was connected to the earth, not just imposed upon it. The talk at the feed store had changed. The pity was gone, replaced by a deep, quiet respect. They no longer referred to her as the Gable widow. They called her Alara. They spoke of her harvest numbers with a kind of awe. The story of how she had fixed the West Bottom became local legend, the details growing slightly with each telling. They said she had a sixth sense about the land, that she could hear what it needed. In a way, they were right. One afternoon in the late spring, a young man came to her door. It was Leo, Jim's youngest son, a boy of 19 who was trying to decide if he wanted to follow his father into farming. He was quiet and observant, with hands that were already calloused from work. "Ma'am," he said, twisting the brim of his hat, "my dad told me about what you did with the bottom field. I've been watching it. It makes sense. More sense than going into debt for a bigger tractor every 5 years." He paused, gathering his courage. "I was wondering," he said. "I know you don't need the help, but I was wondering if maybe I could work for you this summer. I don't care about the pay. I like to learn how you see things." Alara looked at the young man. She saw in his eyes the same curiosity, the same respect for the land that she had seen in a young Silas 30 years ago. He was not looking for a job. He was looking for knowledge. She led him into Silas's office. She took out the old notebooks and the new one she had started. She laid them on the desk. "The work starts here," she said, "by learning how to watch, how to record, how to remember." She had found her successor. The knowledge would not die. It would be passed on, a quiet legacy written in the earth itself, a story not of conquest, but of understanding. The farm continued. The seasons turned. The West Bottom produced, year after year, a quiet, green testament to a forgotten truth. Some problems are not solved by more power or more money, but by a deeper listening. Some knowledge does not become obsolete. It just waits patiently under the surface for someone to remember why it was true in the first place.